So, where would you invest $1 million? The question drifted across the polished mahogany table like a joke everyone was expected to laugh at. And they did. Soft chuckles circled the room beneath the crystal chandeliers of Whitmore House Steakhouse, one of Manhattan's most expensive restaurants. Daniel Whitmore didn't look up when he said it. He rarely did when speaking to waitstaff. At 38, Daniel was the kind of billionaire whose name appeared on financial news every morning before the stock market even opened. Founder of Whitmore Capital, $8 billion under management. A reputation for seeing opportunities 3 moves before anyone else. Tonight, however, he was bored. The dinner meeting had already drifted away from serious business in a casual bragging about market wins and private jet upgrades. Daniel leaned back in his chair, swirling a glass of sparkling water, his $30,000 watch catching the soft golden light of the chandelier. That was when he noticed her. Emily Carter. She moved quietly between tables, refilling glasses and collecting plates with the efficiency of someone who had worked long shifts for years. Most guests barely registered her presence. She wore the standard black vest and white shirt of the restaurant staff, her honey brown hair tied neatly behind her head. Nothing about her suggested anything unusual, which was exactly why Daniel chose her. He raised 2 fingers slightly. "Excuse me." Emily approached with the calm professionalism of someone who had heard every tone of voice customers could produce. "Yes, sir?" she asked, setting a glass of ice water gently on the table. Daniel finally glanced up from his phone. "Let me ask you something," he said casually, the hint of amusement already forming at the corner of his mouth. His colleagues leaned back in their seats, sensing entertainment. "If you had $1 million, Daniel continued, tapping the edge of the table with his finger, "where would you invest it right now?" A few of the men chuckled. One of them muttered, "This should be good." They expected hesitation. Maybe a nervous laugh. Maybe a guess about real estate or a popular tech stock. That was usually how these moments went. Emily didn't laugh. She didn't rush to answer either. She simply placed the water pitcher down, folded her hands lightly in front of her apron, and looked directly at Daniel Whitmore for the first time. It wasn't defiance. It wasn't intimidation either. Just calm attention. Then she spoke. 40% into emerging market energy ETFs, she said evenly. The laughter stopped immediately. Daniel's eyes lifted from his phone screen. Emily continued without changing her tone. 30% into undervalued mid-cap industrial stocks currently trading below intrinsic value due to last quarter's overcorrection. One of the men slowly set down his fork. 20% in municipal bonds for tax-advantaged income. Now Daniel was fully looking at her. The phone in his hand had stopped moving. Emily finished simply. "And I'd keep 10% liquid for strategic acquisitions when volatility creates opportunities." Silence settled over the table. Not awkward silence. Not confused silence. The kind that happens when a room realizes something unexpected has just occurred. Daniel Whitmore slowly placed his phone face down on the table. It was the first time that evening he had done that. For the first time since she arrived, he studied the waitress standing beside his chair. The uniform, the order pad, the calm expression. None of it matched the answer he had just heard. "That's," he said quietly, his voice no longer amused, "a very specific strategy." Emily gave a small, polite nod. "Just an opinion, sir." Around them, the restaurant continued its quiet hum of conversations and clinking glasses. But at Daniel Whitmore's table, something had shifted. The joke had ended. And for the first time that night, the billionaire wasn't the most interesting person in the room. Daniel Whitmore did not return to his conversation immediately. His eyes remained on Emily Carter as if the answer she had given was still echoing in the air between them. Around the table, the other men shifted slightly in their chairs, unsure whether the moment had ended or if something more was about to happen. Finally, Daniel leaned forward, resting his elbows lightly on the table. "Where did you learn that?" he asked. His voice had changed. The casual amusement from earlier had disappeared, replaced by something quieter and far more focused. Emily did not move. She simply picked up the water pitcher again and refilled a glass that was only half empty. "I read a lot," she replied calmly. One of the men at the table laughed under his breath. "Come on," he said, shaking his head. "That was not something you pick up from reading a magazine." Daniel raised a hand slightly, and the man fell silent. Daniel's attention never left Emily. "Emerging market energy funds," Daniel repeated slowly. Mid-cap industrials trading below intrinsic value. Municipal bonds for tax efficiency. He paused. That is not beginner language. Emily offered the same small, polite nod she had given before. You asked where I would invest, sir. I answered. Daniel studied her expression. Most people changed when they realized who he was. They became eager, nervous, sometimes overly friendly. Emily did none of those things. She simply stood there, calm and professional, like someone who had finished explaining the daily special. Across the table, one of Daniel's partners leaned closer. Daniel, he whispered with a grin. Maybe we should hire her. A few quiet laughs followed, but Daniel did not smile this time. Instead, he asked another question. If the market drops 10% next quarter, he said, what happens to that strategy? The table grew quiet again. It was no longer a joke. Emily did not hesitate. Volatility would create buying opportunities, she said, especially in sectors tied to infrastructure expansion. Long-term demand will still be there. Daniel's fingers slowly tapped once against the table. That answer had come even faster than the first. One of the men blinked in surprise. Another quietly lifted his glass, but forgot to drink. Emily checked the small silver watch on her wrist. Is there anything else you would like this evening, sir? She asked. The question was simple, but it carried a subtle signal that the conversation had reached its natural end. Daniel noticed that too. Your name? He said. Emily hesitated only briefly. Emily Carter. Daniel nodded slowly, as if committing the name to memory. Thank you, Miss Carter. She turned and walked away with the same steady pace she had used all night, weaving between tables with effortless efficiency. Within seconds, she was greeting another group of guests as if nothing unusual had happened. But at Daniel Whitmore's table, the mood had shifted completely. One of the men leaned back in his chair. Well, he said quietly, that was unexpected. Another shook his head in disbelief. She sounded like someone from a hedge fund meeting. Daniel said nothing. His eyes followed Emily as she crossed the dining room, balancing two plates with practiced ease. There was something about the way she carried herself. Not confidence exactly. Something calmer than that. Familiar with hard work. Unimpressed by wealth. Daniel had spent his entire career studying people who understood markets. He could usually recognize them within minutes. And the answer she had given earlier did not sound rehearsed. It sounded experienced. Daniel slowly turned his phone back over, but he did not open the screen. Instead, he looked down at the table for a long moment. Then he spoke quietly. Interesting. Across the dining room, Emily Carter placed a check on another table and thanked the guests with a warm smile. To everyone else in the restaurant, she was simply a waitress finishing another shift in Manhattan. But at table 14, a billionaire had just realized something unusual had entered the room, and he was no longer sure it had anything to do with dinner. Daniel Whitmore finished his dinner, but he did not remember the taste of the steak or the conversation that followed. His mind stayed somewhere else in the room. Every few minutes his eyes drifted back across the restaurant floor, searching for the quiet waitress who had spoken about markets as if she had spent years inside them. Emily Carter moved through the evening like a steady current in a busy river. She carried trays, refilled glasses, and greeted guests with the same calm professionalism she had shown earlier. If anyone noticed her at all, it was only as part of the rhythm of the restaurant. But Daniel noticed something different. She listened more than she spoke. When guests discussed business deals or real estate prices, her expression never changed, yet her eyes seemed to follow every word. It reminded Daniel of analysts he had hired straight out of graduate school, the ones who sat silently during meetings while absorbing every number spoken in the room. By the time dessert plates were cleared, Daniel's partners had returned fully to their conversation. One of them was explaining a potential acquisition in Dallas. Another was complaining about interest rates. Daniel barely heard them. Instead, he reached into his jacket and pulled out a sleek black business card. He waited until Emily passed near the table again. Miss Carter, he said quietly. She stopped beside his chair. Yes, sir. Daniel slid the card across the table toward her. In case you ever decide to work somewhere else. Emily looked down at the card. Whitmore Capital was printed in clean silver letters beneath Daniel's name. She did not pick it up immediately. Instead, she asked politely, Are you finished with your meal, sir? Daniel almost smiled. Yes. Emily collected the empty glass and the unused napkin beside his plate. Only then did she take the card between her fingers. She studied it for a moment, then slipped it into the small pocket of her apron. Thank you, she said simply. Daniel expected curiosity, questions, perhaps even excitement. Instead, she gave the same professional nod she gave every guest. Then she turned and walked away again. Daniel watched her disappear behind the service counter. One of his partners leaned forward with a grin. Daniel, he said, you just tried to recruit a waitress. Another laughed. Next thing you know, she will be running your investment committee. The table erupted with quiet amusement. Daniel did not laugh with them. Instead, he reached for his phone and opened a secure messaging application. His fingers typed quickly. Background check. Emily Carter. Whitmore House Steakhouse. Priority. The reply came less than 30 seconds later. Understood. Preliminary information by morning. Daniel slipped the phone back into his jacket. Across the dining room, Emily Carter was wiping down an empty table while speaking kindly to an elderly couple finishing their coffee. She looked exactly like every other hard-working server in Manhattan. Nothing about her appearance suggested financial models or market strategy. And yet Daniel could not shake the feeling that he had just heard the kind of thinking he usually paid $200,000 a year to find. 10 minutes later, he stood to leave. The restaurant manager hurried over with a polite smile. Mr. Whitmore, it is always an honor to have you here. Daniel nodded politely, but his attention drifted once more toward the service station where Emily was organizing receipts. For a brief moment, their eyes met across the room. She gave a small professional smile. Nothing more. No recognition of status. No special attention. Just courtesy. Daniel walked out into the cool Manhattan night, where his driver waited beside a black sedan. As the car pulled away from the glowing restaurant windows, Daniel Whitmore looked back once more through the glass. Somewhere inside that dining room was a waitress who had answered a question most people in finance would struggle to explain clearly. And for the first time in years, Daniel felt something unusual stirring in his thoughts. Curiosity. The next morning in Manhattan began the way it always did for Daniel Whitmore, with the quiet glow of 3 monitors illuminating the glass walls of his office 40 floors above the city. Outside, the streets below were already filled with taxis, delivery trucks, and the steady rhythm of a city that never waited for anyone. Inside Whitmore Capital, the atmosphere was calm, precise, and efficient. Analysts moved between desks carrying tablets and coffee cups while large screens displayed market data flowing across the room in steady streams of numbers. Daniel stood near the window with a cup of black coffee, watching the opening bell coverage on a financial news channel that played silently on the wall. Normally mornings like this were predictable. Numbers moved. Opportunities appeared. Decisions were made. But today his thoughts kept drifting somewhere unexpected. At exactly 8:32, his phone vibrated once on the glass desk behind him. The message he had requested the night before had arrived. Daniel walked back to the desk and opened the report. The document was short. Surprisingly short. Emily Carter. Age 26. Current occupation listed as restaurant server at Whitmore House Steakhouse. Employment history showed a series of hospitality jobs over the past 4 years. No financial firms. No internships. No graduate programs. Daniel frowned slightly and scrolled further. Education listed, Hudson Community College. Associate degree incomplete. No further records. Daniel leaned back slowly in his chair. That did not match the voice he had heard last night. Analysts with Master of Business Administration degrees sometimes struggled to explain portfolio diversification with that level of clarity. Yet the background report suggested nothing unusual. Just another young woman working long shifts in Manhattan's restaurant industry. Daniel tapped the edge of the desk thoughtfully. Something about the information felt unfinished, like the last page of a book had been removed. His assistant, Laura Bennett, appeared at the doorway holding a tablet. Good morning, Daniel. The infrastructure investment meeting begins in 10 minutes. Daniel nodded without looking up. Laura, he said calmly, do we have any analysts who studied at Hudson Community College? She blinked in mild surprise. Not that I am aware of. Daniel turned the tablet toward her. Take a look at this profile. Laura read the short report quickly. Her eyebrows lifted slightly. A waitress, she asked carefully. Daniel did not answer the question directly. Instead he said, her explanation of municipal bond allocation was better than what I heard from 2 candidates last quarter. Laura looked at him with quiet curiosity, but did not comment. Working for Daniel Whitmore meant learning when questions were unnecessary. Across the office floor, the analysts were preparing presentation slides for the morning meeting. Market forecasts, risk projections, and portfolio breakdowns filled the screens. Daniel watched them for a moment. Smart people, talented people, every one of them carefully selected through months of interviews. And yet the most interesting financial answer he had heard all week had come from someone carrying a water pitcher. Daniel stood and slipped his jacket on. "Laura," he said, walking toward the conference room door, "scheduled dinner at Whitmore House again tonight." She glanced up from her tablet. "Another client meeting?" Daniel paused briefly before answering. "Something like that." Several hours later, while the trading floor buzzed with activity and investment strategies were debated across the conference table, a quiet restaurant server across the city was finishing her morning subway ride to work. Emily Carter stepped onto the crowded platform, her apron folded neatly inside her bag. She walked toward the street with the same calm focus she carried every day. She had no idea that 40 floors above Manhattan, a billionaire was already planning to ask her another question. That evening, the lights of Manhattan reflected across the tall windows of Whitmore House Steakhouse once again, and inside the restaurant the quiet rhythm of dinner service had already begun. Emily Carter moved between tables with steady focus, her order pad balanced in one hand while the other carried a tray of glasses that chimed softly with each careful step. It had been a long day already. The subway ride had been crowded, the afternoon shift busy, and the dinner reservations were now filling the room with the familiar mix of business meetings and quiet celebrations. To most guests, the restaurant felt elegant and effortless, but Emily knew how many hours of quiet work stood behind that illusion. She was placing menus on a newly seated table when the front doors opened again. A tall man stepped inside wearing a dark charcoal coat and a calm expression that seemed almost out of place in the busy dining room. Several employees noticed him immediately. Daniel Whitmore was not the type of guest people forgot. The hostess straightened slightly. "Good evening, Mr. Whitmore," she said politely. "Welcome back." Daniel returned the greeting with a small nod. "Thank you." His eyes moved through the dining room for only a moment before stopping. Emily Carter was standing near table 9, explaining the evening specials to a couple celebrating an anniversary. Daniel noticed the way she spoke clearly but never rushed, giving the guests time to decide without pressure. It was a small detail, but it said something about patience. The hostess gestured toward a quiet table near the window. "Your usual seat is available." Daniel sat down and ordered sparkling water while the city lights shimmered beyond the glass. For several minutes, he watched the dining room quietly, observing the patterns of movement across the floor. Emily continued working from table to table without looking in his direction. When she finally approached his table, it was with the same calm professionalism she offered every other guest. "Good evening, sir," she said. "Would you like to hear the specials tonight?" Daniel looked up from the menu, even though he had barely read a word. "Good evening, Miss Carter." Emily paused slightly, recognizing him now. "Welcome back," she replied politely. Daniel set the menu aside. "I believe I still owe you a question." Emily tilted her head slightly. "Sir." Daniel folded his hands on the table. "Last night you explained how you would invest $1 million. But you did not explain something else." Emily waited quietly. Daniel continued. "Why someone who understands markets like that is carrying a water pitcher in a restaurant?" For a brief moment, the busy sounds of the dining room seemed to fade behind the question. Emily did not answer immediately. Instead, she placed the water glass carefully in front of him and filled it halfway. The small movement gave her a few seconds to think. When she finally spoke, her voice was calm but thoughtful. Because understanding something and having the opportunity to use it are not always the same thing. Daniel studied her expression carefully. It was not frustration he saw, not bitterness either. Just a quiet honesty that felt unusually direct. "Opportunity tends to appear for people who look for it," Daniel said. Emily gave a faint smile. "Sometimes," she replied gently, "but sometimes people are simply busy surviving." Daniel leaned back slightly in his chair. The answer was not dramatic. It was not defensive. It was simply true. Around them, the restaurant continued its steady hum of conversation and soft music, but Daniel Whitmore felt the same quiet curiosity return that had followed him all morning. He had come back expecting answers. Instead, he had found a question that seemed even more interesting. Daniel Whitmore did not respond immediately to Emily's answer. He simply watched her for a moment. as if measuring the weight of the words she had just spoken. Around them, the restaurant continued its familiar rhythm. Glasses clinked softly. Conversations rose and faded like distant waves. Somewhere near the bar, a quiet laugh drifted through the air. But at Daniel's table, the atmosphere felt different, calmer, more focused. Emily remained standing beside the table with the same composed posture she carried throughout the restaurant. She had already asked if he would like to hear the specials, and technically the conversation should have moved forward. Yet neither of them rushed the moment. Daniel finally lifted the water glass and took a slow sip before setting it back down. "Surviving," he repeated quietly. Emily gave a small nod. "Yes, sir." Daniel studied her expression carefully. He had met thousands of people in boardrooms, conferences, and negotiation rooms across the country. Most people talked about opportunity as if it were something waiting around the corner for anyone brave enough to reach for it. But the way Emily said the word surviving carried a different tone. Not dramatic, not self-pitying, just honest. "You do not seem like someone who stopped looking for opportunity," Daniel said. Emily folded her hands lightly in front of her apron. "I did not stop," she replied. "I just had to choose which opportunity mattered first." Daniel raised an eyebrow slightly. Emily continued, her voice calm and steady. 3 years ago, my father's construction company went bankrupt. Medical bills followed not long after that. She paused briefly, as if deciding how much to explain. Someone had to keep the apartment and the lights on. Daniel listened without interrupting. Emily did not sound embarrassed by the story. She simply stated it the way someone might describe a change in the weather. "College was the opportunity one wanted," she said softly. "Working here became the opportunity one needed." Daniel leaned back slowly in his chair, absorbing the explanation. In his world, problems were usually solved with capital, strategy, and timing. But Emily was describing something simpler and far more familiar to millions of people across the country. Responsibility. Across the room, another waiter passed by carrying a tray of plates, and Emily instinctively stepped aside to clear the path. Then she returned her attention to Daniel. "Have you decided what you would like for dinner, sir?" she asked politely. Daniel glanced down at the menu but did not open it. Instead, he asked another question. "If you had stayed in school, what would you be studying right now?" Emily answered without hesitation. "Financial economics." Daniel almost smiled. "I suspected something like that." Emily allowed herself a faint smile in return. "Numbers make sense to me." Daniel tapped the table lightly with his finger as a thought formed in his mind. "You know," he said calmly, "Whitmore Capital hires analysts every year who studied that exact field." Emily nodded once. "I believe they do." Daniel looked directly at her. "And many of them would have struggled to explain municipal bond allocation the way you did last night." Emily did not react with pride or excitement. Instead, she gave the same quiet answer she had given before. Understanding a concept is not the same as having the chance to apply it. Daniel leaned forward slightly. "Sometimes chances appear when someone is paying attention." Emily met his gaze calmly. "And sometimes," she replied gently, "people have to finish the shift they already started." For a moment, Daniel Whitmore said nothing at all. Then he closed the menu and looked up at her again with a thoughtful expression that had not been there the night before. Something about this conversation had changed the tone of the evening. The billionaire who had returned with curiosity was beginning to realize that the quiet waitress standing beside his table might be far more disciplined than many people who already worked inside his office. Daniel Whitmore finally opened the menu, though it was clear his attention remained somewhere else entirely. The soft glow of the restaurant lights reflected across the polished table, while the quiet hum of evening conversations continued around them. Emily Carter waited patiently beside the table, giving him the same courtesy she gave every guest. After a few seconds, Daniel closed the menu again without reading it. "I will take the ribeye," he said calmly, "medium rare, and sparkling water." Emily nodded once and wrote the order on her pad with quick, precise handwriting. "Of course, sir." She turned to leave, but Daniel spoke again before she had taken 2 steps. "Miss Carter." She looked back. "Yes, sir." Daniel rested one hand lightly on the edge of the table. "You said earlier that you had to choose the opportunity that mattered first." Emily nodded slightly. "Yes." Daniel's voice remained calm but thoughtful. "So tell me something. If that responsibility disappeared tomorrow, what would you do next?" Emily considered the question for a moment. It was not the type of question most guests asked during dinner service. Finally, she answered quietly. I would finish what I started. Daniel watched her carefully. Financial economics. Yes. Daniel leaned back in his chair and folded his arms loosely. Graduate school? Emily gave a small shrug. Eventually, Daniel noticed the way she said the word. Not hopeful, not doubtful, simply patient. The patience of someone who had already accepted that some goals take longer than expected. Around them, the restaurant staff moved quickly between tables as more guests arrived. Emily glanced briefly across the room, keeping track of her other responsibilities. Daniel noticed that too. Go ahead, he said calmly. Your other tables are waiting. Emily gave a polite nod. Your dinner will be ready shortly. She walked away again, disappearing into the steady movement of the dining room. Daniel remained seated quietly, watching the reflections of city lights beyond the window. 10 minutes later, Emily returned carrying his plate with practiced balance. She placed the dish carefully in front of him and stepped back. Ribeye medium rare. Daniel glanced down briefly before looking back up at her. Thank you. Emily prepared to leave again, but Daniel spoke once more. Miss Carter. She paused. Yes, sir. Daniel reached into the inside pocket of his jacket and placed something on the table. Not a business card this time. A simple folded piece of paper. Emily looked down at it, but did not touch it. What is it? She asked politely. A question, Daniel replied. Emily raised an eyebrow slightly. Daniel slid the paper toward her across the table. Inside is a short investment scenario, he explained. Something my analysts debated this morning. Emily hesitated. Sir, I am currently working. Daniel nodded calmly. I know. Emily looked at the folded paper again. Then why give it to me? Daniel's answer came without hesitation. Because you said you would finish what you started. For a moment, Emily said nothing. The restaurant noise continued around them, plates clinking softly in the background. Finally, she picked up the paper and slipped it into the pocket of her apron. I will look at it later, she said. Daniel nodded once. That is all I ask. Emily offered a polite smile and returned to her work. Daniel Whitmore cut into his steak, but barely tasted it. Across the dining room, the quiet waitress continued serving tables with calm efficiency. But now Daniel knew something the rest of the room did not. Somewhere in the pocket of her apron was a problem that had occupied an entire room of professional analysts that morning. And for the first time since the meeting ended, Daniel Whitmore was genuinely curious to see who would solve it first. The folded paper remained in the pocket of Emily Carter's apron for the rest of the evening. Dinner service moved quickly as the restaurant filled to capacity, and the rhythm of the shift demanded her full attention. Orders were taken, plates delivered, glasses refilled, and receipts signed. For the guests seated under the warm lights of Whitmore House Steakhouse, the evening felt elegant and effortless. For the staff moving between the tables, it was simply another busy night in Manhattan. Daniel Whitmore finished his dinner quietly. He did not ask about the paper again. Instead, he paid the check, left a generous tip, and stepped out into the cool night air where his driver waited at the curb. Before entering the car, he glanced once more through the restaurant window. Inside, Emily Carter was carrying a tray toward another table, focused entirely on her work. Daniel said nothing as the car pulled away into the city traffic. Hours later, the restaurant lights dimmed one section at a time. The final guests left, chairs were reset, and the quiet sound of cleaning filled the room. Emily wiped down the last table and untied the strings of her apron behind her back. Her feet ached slightly from the long shift, but the calm silence after closing always felt like a small reward. She stepped into the employee locker room and placed her apron on the wooden bench. The folded piece of paper slipped from the pocket and landed beside it. For a moment, she simply stared at it. She remembered the way Daniel Whitmore had slid it across the table earlier. A question, he had called it. Emily sat down and unfolded the paper slowly. Inside was a short paragraph describing a hypothetical market situation. A mid-sized infrastructure company preparing to expand into 3 states. Rising interest rates, uncertain commodity prices, and a decision about whether the firm should finance growth through debt, equity, or a hybrid structure. Beneath the scenario was a single line written in clear handwriting. What would you do if this were your portfolio? Emily leaned back slightly against the locker room wall, reading the problem again. It was not a trick question. It was a real decision, the kind financial analysts debated in meeting rooms every day. She closed her eyes for a moment, picturing the variables in her mind the same way she used to during long study sessions years earlier. Interest rates meant borrowing costs. Commodity volatility affected construction margins. Expansion across multiple states introduced regulatory variables and logistical risk. Emily opened her eyes and reached for a pen from her bag. The quiet locker room echoed softly with the faint sound of the pen moving across the paper. She wrote steadily, outlining a balanced strategy that reduced risk while preserving long-term growth potential. Debt alone would expose the company to interest pressure. Equity alone would dilute ownership. A structured hybrid approach combined with phased expansion offered the strongest stability. 20 minutes passed before she finally set the pen down. Emily looked at the page once more and folded the paper carefully along its original crease. Outside, the city lights reflected across the empty street as she stepped out of the restaurant and into the cool air of the late evening. She slipped the paper back into her bag without another thought. For her, it was simply an interesting problem. But across the city, inside a quiet office high above Manhattan, Daniel Whitmore was still awake reviewing the same scenario on a glowing screen, unaware that the waitress who had carried his dinner earlier that night had already written an answer. The next morning arrived quietly over Manhattan as sunlight spread across the glass towers of the financial district. Inside Whitmore Capital, the trading floor had already begun its usual rhythm of early meetings and market analysis. Screens glowed with numbers. Analysts discussed forecasts in low voices. Coffee cups rested beside laptops filled with charts and projections. Daniel Whitmore stood at the long conference table reviewing the infrastructure scenario that had occupied his attention since the previous evening. The same question remained on the screen in front of him. What would you do if this were your portfolio? Around the table, 3 senior analysts were already debating possible approaches. One suggested aggressive expansion funded through debt before interest rates climbed further. Another argued for issuing new equity to protect the company from financial pressure. A third recommended delaying the expansion entirely until commodity prices stabilized. Each strategy carried its own logic. Each came with its own risk. Daniel listened quietly without interrupting. Finally, he closed the presentation file and leaned back slightly in his chair. "We will revisit this later," he said calmly. The analysts exchanged curious glances, but nodded. Daniel rarely ended a discussion before reaching a decision. Yet today he seemed more interested in waiting. That evening Daniel returned once again to Whitmore House Steakhouse. The hostess greeted him with the same polite smile as before, and he took the same quiet table near the window. The city lights shimmered across the glass as dinner service began. Across the dining room, Emily Carter moved between tables with the same calm efficiency she carried every night. When she eventually approached his table, she placed a glass of water in front of him without a word. Daniel looked up. "Good evening, Miss Carter." Emily nodded politely. "Good evening, sir." Daniel rested his hands lightly on the table. "Did you look at the question?" Emily reached into the pocket of her apron and placed the folded paper on the table beside his glass. "Yes," she said. Daniel opened the paper slowly. His eyes moved across the page, reading the lines Emily had written the night before. For a moment he said nothing. The restaurant noise faded into the background as he read the explanation again. Structured hybrid financing. Phased expansion. Risk reduction through diversified capital structure. The reasoning was precise, clear, and surprisingly disciplined. Daniel looked up at her. "My analysts debated this for 40 minutes this morning." Emily tilted her head slightly. "And?" Daniel folded the paper again with careful attention. "None of them suggested the hybrid structure you described." Emily did not appear impressed by that information. Instead, she said quietly, "It seemed logical." Daniel watched her for a long moment. Then he slid the folded paper back toward her. "Miss Carter," he said calmly, "Whitmore Capital hires analysts who spend years studying problems exactly like this." Emily remained silent. Daniel continued, "You solved it after a 12-hour shift." The room around them continued its soft murmur of conversation and music, but the moment between them felt still. Emily finally spoke. "I only answered the question you gave me." Daniel nodded slowly. "Yes," he said, "you did." He paused briefly before adding one final sentence. "And sometimes the most valuable people in a room are the ones no one thinks to ask." Emily stood quietly beside the table as the words settled between them. Across the dining room, the restaurant continued its steady rhythm of plates, glasses, and conversations about business and life. But for Daniel Whitmore, the lesson of the past 2 days had become unmistakably clear. Intelligence does not always sit at the head of the table. Sometimes it stands quietly beside it, holding a water pitcher, waiting for someone to finally ask the right question.